All right, I want to thank everybody for joining today. We're going to go ahead and give folks a couple more minutes to sign in. We'll plan on kicking things off here in another 2 or 3 minutes. And before we get into things, just go ahead and confirm. Can everyone see my screen and hear me okay? Great, thanks, Layman. All right, we'll go ahead and get kicked off here. Looks like we've got a bunch of folks on the call. I expect a few more will join as we go through this. So real quick, do a quick introduction, and then we'll go through a couple of ground rules for the webinar here, and then we'll get into things. So I'm Eric Miranda. I lead our customer operations at Tulip Interfaces. I'm going to be talking to you today a little bit about how we're seeing our customers increase their production capacity in response to significant shocks like COVID-19, and want to talk more generally about some steps you can take to help with this across all your manufacturing operations. So before we get into the webinar, I guess a couple of ground rules here. So first and foremost, if you have a question, feel free to go ahead and throw it in the webinar chat. I'd be happy to host this as more of a conversation than just me presenting a bunch of slides. Regardless, I'll make sure and save some time for questions and answers at the end of the webinar. Until we get to that point, everybody is on mute. So Srini, I saw that you posted a chat here. People won't be able to voice in, but if you do have something you'd like to add, feel free to go ahead and include it in the chat, and we'll address that as we go through the webinar here. So we'll go ahead and kick things off. So I think there's really two key objectives for the webinar today, and we'll have 4 different sections. So the first objective here is to talk about, how did we end up, what's the evolution of the manufacturing operation system that we have today? So, massively complex systems that exist within very complex markets. So I want to talk just a little bit about sort of the state of these systems and how we got there. And then the second key part of this is going to be, where do we go from here? So what are some concrete steps you can take to mitigate the complexity within your operation? And how can you increase both flexibility and speed within your manufacturing operation? Now, since we scheduled this just in the last couple of weeks, there's been a couple of really interesting things to kick off that Tulip has had the opportunity to become involved with. I want to share just a little bit of a real world example of how is somebody going from absolutely zero to ramping up a full new product line across a distributed operation, literally in a matter of weeks. So there's some pretty interesting open source projects that are trying to get much needed protective equipment to our medical service providers. And Tulip is using a lot of the methods that we're going to be talking about today, is the system that's helping organize and enable a lot of this. And then, as I mentioned at the end, make sure and we save some time for Q&A. But any questions between now and then, please feel free to raise your hand, or just go ahead and throw some comments in the chat box, and we'll address it as we go here. All right. So the first thing is, how did we get here? What's the status of the modern manufacturing operation? What are the systems that enable this operation? And what's the evolution that led us into this place? And so I think if we think about the modern manufacturing operation, this is a system that historically has been viewed as a largely static system. So if we think back to Taylorism in the scientific management theory, if you think to the Ford's assembly line, for example, the idea here is that you have a knowable number of inputs, and you're producing a predefined set of outputs, right? And so the question then becomes, how do you best organize your resources to add value throughout the value stream to produce this finished good? And if we think about the assembly line as an example, the key insight here is that we're narrowing the scope of any individual worker. We're focusing their work, which means they require less training, which means that they can produce much more quickly. The problem is, as you do this, what you end up sacrificing is flexibility. So on the one hand, you have a job shop or artisans producing one-off, custom-made, custom-designed products. And on the other hand, you have massive at-scale manufacturing that just pumps out finished products here. And so I think if we look at the challenges facing the modern manufacturing operation, I mean, at the end of the day, this is a highly competitive market, and the people who win are the people who are able to produce their products most efficiently. So you want to produce the optimal number of widgets per unit resource. And if you look at the way that the systems have evolved, they've very much evolved to accomplish that end. So we typically don't see most manufacturing operations designed for resilience. They typically are designed to operate optimally in an optimally efficient manner, which means that for every unit resource, we're deploying them in the most efficient way possible to squeeze out every basis point of margin that we can get from the operation. And so that works pretty well in this idea of having a very well architected assembly line type approach to a manufacturing operation. Works great. The challenge here is that as these systems have become more and more complex, global supply chains, hundreds, sometimes thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands. I was on the phone with a customer just yesterday who has 350,000 employees, right? And they're dealing with this the impact of COVID. I mean, the point here is that these supply chains and the operations that produce these items that we're ultimately selling, they've just massively more complex than they were in previous eras. And that complexity has presented a lot of unique challenges. To further confound, to make things even more challenging, it's not like it used to be, where oftentimes we're producing just hundreds of thousands of the same product. I mean, the reality is that we live in a much more agile environment where customer demands change, and we need to scale up production of product A, but we need to scale down production of product B. We're selling more iPhones than we anticipated, but then something happens like COVID-19 and iPhone sales completely plummet. So, you know, this idea of having an optimally efficient manufacturing operation is in tension with this resilient, flexible, agile system. And the reality is that, you know, what we need today more than ever is some sort of balance of the two. So if we think about this, you know, if we think about you know, the type of system that I just outlined, you know, these big manufacturing operations, you know, if we sort of double click into these operations and look at the systems that support this, I mean, you have, as I said, hundreds of thousands of workers sometimes, at the very least, often many hundreds of workers, you know, all working together to accomplish some sort of common objective. And if we look at, you know, how are they organized? How do we, you know, how do we align efforts here and make sure that everybody's, you know, contributing in the way that makes the most sense for them and in the way that is most needed at any given point in time? You know, a lot of times we, you know, we look at these systems and we're thinking like ERP systems or MES systems. You know, a lot of times these systems are ill-equipped while they're able to handle very well, you know, a static system requirement where you're producing hundreds of thousands of the same units. What they're not great at doing is operating in a dynamic environment where you need to scale up production very quickly. You need to shift, you know, you need to introduce a new product very quickly. You need to shift focus from product A to product B. You need to ramp up and train a new workforce very quickly. These systems don't lend themselves very well to these types of dynamic environments. And I think we see this primarily in two different categories. The first is that, you know, if we take these monolithic systems, a lot of times they started in one area. So, you know, if we take an MES, for example, you know, sometimes they start, you know, at the automation level and they start to build up from there to incorporate additional functionality and sort of sprawl and take into account different challenges that are being encountered on the shop floor. Or oftentimes they didn't evolve at all. I think a lot of times at Tulip, what we see is a lot of our customers, you know, even those that do have these systems, whether, you know, brand name or bespoke, a lot of times they're still, we still see them using pen and paper to track their production, to track their processes. A lot of times it's not uncommon to see, you know, people using stopwatches to try and understand how long a particular process should take, or, you know, physically counting work in progress to see where they are with respect to their production targets. And so I think fundamentally what we see is that there's this tension between this very complex manufacturing operations system and the operation itself and the systems that enable that operation. And this is not, to be clear, when we talk about scaling up production very quickly, this is not something that is, you know, specifically and exclusively necessitated by, you know, the recent events with COVID-19. I mean, this is something that's happening more generally across the segment, across the manufacturing industry. I mean, if, you know, McKinsey and Company is suggesting that over the next 5 years, that the manufacturing industrial sectors are going to see more disruption in the next 5 years than they have in the past 20 combined. And this is really a result of, one, these systems need to operate in a more dynamic way than they did previously. And then two, they're just far more complex. The options that are available to the process engineers, the people who are responsible for managing the operation, the people who are responsible for ensuring profitability of these operations, the tools that are available to them are increasing, and that's the resulting complexity is necessitating this type of transition. And so the question is, where do we go from here? So what are some things that very concretely can be done to help manage this complexity and help empower the people on the shop floor? So I think first, if we think about, you know, if we accept that these manufacturing operations are transitioning from monolithic, architected design, I guess, optimally efficient, designed to produce oftentimes high volume by narrowing the scope of each individual, then if we accept that this model of the world is changing, then what, I guess, what comes in its place, what takes its place? And so if this is changing, what replaces it? What we're seeing more and more is that manufacturers are just having to become increasingly agile to respond to these shifting demands. They need to be able to move supply chains very quickly. They need to be able to ramp up production very quickly. They need to be able to reskill their workforce very quickly. And so how do you do that? And so in this type of an environment, I would argue that it's flexibility and the ability to decentralize the production and the management of these operations that is even more important than just pure efficiency or or optimization. Or I guess put a bit more clearly that there's a balance between the optimization, which is trying to find that perfect balance between at scale production and and optimal efficiency, and building a system that is resilient to the types of shocks that that are both expected, things like increasing commodity prices, or or having to deal with this when a supplier shifting suppliers or something like this. These things that are highly predictable, to these types of things that are largely unpredictable, these black swan events, things like COVID-19. And fundamentally, what we're seeing is that the software the software systems that need to support these types of operations, like gone are the days where you can go through a 2-year requisition process where you define the perfect requirements, you pass out a functional spec, you contract a third party to design a boat or customize like a highly specific system for your operation, something that takes months, something that can take even longer than that. Those days are gone, and the cycle that's needed for this type of development, this type of iteration now is measured, not in months, not in weeks, but in hours. So, something happens on the shop floor. You need to get out there and you need to respond to it real time. You don't have time to go through and customize a monolithic software system. What you need is a tool that you can use to be able to enable this kind of customization at the operator level, at the engineering level, very quickly. And so the way we see this playing out in Tulip is, Tulip, to give those who aren't familiar a little bit of context here, it's a no-code application platform that's really designed to empower that frontline worker on the shop floor. So, the idea is that manufacturing engineers, industrial engineers, supervisors, they can get in here, they can build applications that are very specific in nature, and they can build them as easily as if they were building a PowerPoint presentation. And so this looks a lot, you can think of the product as looking and feeling a lot like PowerPoint, that you can add if then else logic to, that you can then connect to your machines, your sensors, your devices, that you can then run analytics on top of. And so the idea here is that in democratizing these types of technology tools, what you enable is a much more agile production system. And so it starts with the shop floor process. You have individual manufacturing engineers responsible for a small part of the operation. They build the applications that they need to collect the data that they need to be able to manage that operation, and also to be able to give the people on that line the context and the information they need to be able to inform better decision making. So sometimes this could look like providing something like work instructions. Sometimes this means machine monitoring or performance dashboards, quality audits, things like this. But the idea here is that you build the application you need, you push it out to the shop floor, and then you start collecting real-time data about how your operation is running. And then you can use this data, you can use this information, these insights, to inform how you want to go about retooling the operation. And so the whole goal here is to identify these to track, to measure, to inform making, and then to identify sources of inefficiency so you can eliminate those sources of inefficiency. And so this is a very different approach. So rather than starting at the trying to understand the manufacturing operation in its entirety, all of the ins and outs and all of the requirements and all of the all of the demands for each different part of the operation, the goal here is to decentralize this decision making, to empower the people on the shop floor with a better set of tools, and then start capturing the data you need in a much more bottom-up way. And so that's a little bit about what are some of, like, philosophically, how do you adopt an agile method of working in the manufacturing operation, and then specifically as it relates to Tulip, how does Tulip enable that? But and I talked about this a little bit, but again, so how do we get there? How do we enable these manufacturing operations with a much more agile philosophy, and make available to them much more much more, much quicker, much faster, easier to use tools. The first and foremost, the idea here is to democratize technology, to democratize the technology in your manufacturing operation. So again, rather than starting from a requirements-based perspective where you're saying, what is this? We're going to, roll out an MES or something, say, for example. We're going to go ahead and define all of the requirements that are necessary. We're going to produce a functional spec. We're going to bid that out to different contractors. We're then going to start designing this. We're going to go through a number of different design iterations, and then we're going to go ahead and build this monolithic system, and we're going to roll it out top down to the shop floor. The key point here is that that no longer works in this increasingly agile manufacturing world. What you really need to do to empower these folks and to accelerate the speed with which you can introduce new product and ramp up production, as well as just more generally to have flexibility built into these operations, what you really need to do is put the power, put the tools in the hands of that frontline worker. So we want to give them control over their processes, and the technology should work for them, not the other way around. And so, as I mentioned, the way we do this at Tulip is by making available to them our no-code app platform. And so what you're looking at to the right here is a snapshot of the app builder. So it's modeled after visual presentation software. Again, if you can build a PowerPoint presentation, you can build an application in Tulip. These applications have the added power, the added benefit of being able to connect to your machines, your sensors, your devices, to be able to connect into your back-end systems, to be able to incorporate these data streams into these applications. And then again, you can run analytics on top of these, which allows you to make better decision-making on the shop floor where the work is actually being done and where these systems actually need to be producing the value. So the first thing is democratizing the technology and giving this to the frontline worker in the shop floor. The second thing, as I mentioned before, we often see folks, we oftentimes see folks, our customers using tools like pen and paper, tools like production trackers, sometimes physical clickers. We see stopwatches being used to track cycle time. And I think first and foremost, the reason these tools are used is because they're flexible, because anybody can pick one up, they can go over to the printer, they can hit print, they can stick the stuff on a clipboard and they can hand it out to a supervisor and say, hey, this is the information I need. So, I think my intention isn't to diminish the value of these tools. I think they're incredibly valuable. The problem is when you capture data on some sort of analog system like this, it remains captured. You can't use that data to inform better decision making until it's transcribed into some other system. So sometimes this means physically transcribing it into into an Excel spreadsheet and running some analytics and pushing those to dashboards. At Tulip we say, don't even bother. Just go ahead and start with the application that is purpose built for that particular requirement, and then capture the data right off the bat. So, rather than having to go through a piece of paper and losing that valuable time, that time that you could be iterating on the process and improving things, just go ahead and put it automatically into the appropriate app. Design an app that captures the information you need, that's giving the operator, the associate, the context they need to do their job properly. And that this is like a key pillar of how you enable flexibility and accelerate the ramp of new products in a manufacturing environment. The third thing that is critically important here is improving the visibility of the operation. So, you have this no-code app builder. You can enable people to build applications that are specific to the challenges that they're facing in their line. They can give operators better information. They can capture production critical information. The next thing you need to do is do something with all of this great data that you're capturing. And so this typically takes the form of some sort of performance dashboard. What you're looking at above, this is a machine monitoring dashboard that's just quite simply showing real-time status of the various machines. But I mean, the idea is anything that's being captured, there's a reason you're capturing this, and somebody needs to consume it real time. So one of our customers here, they started their journey with Tulip by doing something very simple. It was a simple quality form at the end of a assembly line. So, it would go through all the different stations, and at the last station, there was a person whose job it was to inspect every single unit to make sure that it satisfied the quality requirements. And if it did not, what they would do is they would just simply, they would mark that it had failed, and they would say, why did it fail? And so typically all of this information had been tracked on pen and paper, but when they transition over to a Tulip app to capture this real time, what they were able to do now is to take the iteration cycle from quite literally weeks, because at the end of the week, what would happen is all of these quality forms would be entered into Excel. They would print out, a set of analyses to say, what were the problems last week and how are we going to do better next week. But the problem was that the cycle time there was just, it was the iteration cycle time, that is, it was just far too slow to meaningfully impact the problem here. And so what they did is they just quite simply put one application on the shop floor. They captured this data, they made it available in a dashboard, and in doing so, they transitioned the whole organization from thinking in terms of, I'm going to do my job well, I'm going to track whatever I see that's wrong, and I'm going to try my best, but I don't really know I don't really know how the whole system is performing today. They transitioned from that to a real-time performance dashboard that would show, how many units have we produced as a team? What's my first pass yield of these units? Of the units that have failed the quality inspection, why did they fail? And then what they did shortly thereafter is associate that with a unique upstream root cause. And so in doing this, they're pushing that accountability to the shop floor. And this is really the third key pillar of how do you enable this type of digital transformation, and why is that this digital transformation necessary to support ramping new product very quickly and to build flexibility into the supply chain, into the manufacturing operation. And this is something I think increasingly what we're seeing is about 60% of our customer base are either operating at today, that is, and this is in a post-COVID world, about 60% of our customer base today are operating, they're running their operations, either A, they've suspended operations altogether. This accounts for about 20% of them, but about 40% of them are operating with some sort of reduced staff. So a lot of times support personnel, engineers, the folks who need to become involved if something in the operation is going wrong, the people who are solving these problems, your MEs, a lot of times these folks are staying home. They're not there anymore to directly observe issues on the shop floor, and they're not there for folks to escalate these problems to them so they can help solve these problems. And so I think in this day and age, it becomes increasingly important to enable remote monitoring of these operations. So oftentimes we see remote monitoring deployed on machine monitoring, on machining cells, but remote monitoring of manual production operations is equally as important. So again, these are the performance dashboards that I talked about, but they're designed, they're slightly more distilled to give the manager the information they need to understand. Do I need to make a phone call? Is there a problem on the operation? Do we have a supplier issue? Where am I with respect to my daily production targets? How am I doing on my first pass yield? And am I going to be able to meet this delivery? That's supposed to go out at the end of the week. So expanding remote monitoring operations is critically important to enabling this end. And then I think a final point here is, all of the operations or all of the functionality that I've been discussing so far, being agile, democratizing these tools, democratizing technology, and giving your people on the shop floor a better set of tools. All of this is all well and good if you're not operating in a regulated environment. But a lot of times folks are concerned. They say, well, listen, like everything has to go through a strict review process. Everything has to be approved by multiple people before it can be put into production. I'm auditable if we're looking at the pharma or med device. I'm auditable by the FDA. So what does this mean for me? How do I handle this? How do I resolve this tension between being completely agile and enabling folks to implement improvements where they see opportunity to do so, and satisfying that regulatory requirement? And this slide is included because I think it's really important to call out that these same problems exist in these regulated environments as well. And I want to specifically call out that Tulip is is CFR 21 Part 11 compliant. We have a complete audit history, e-signature, and all of the functionality that you need to deploy these same solutions in a regulated environment. So, and in addition to that, there's a number of app bundles and ready-to-go apps that that are specifically designed for the needs of our med device and pharma customer base. And as of today, I would say that about 40% of our customer base is actually operating in this environment. So just because I'm talking about agile, I'm talking about enabling bottom-up process improvements, don't think that that's mutually exclusive with satisfying the regulatory requirements that's been that these types of operations have to operate within. Okay, so I've gone ahead and let's see here. So these are the key points for how do you, how do you ramp up your production operation very quickly, and how can you think about deploying technology in a way that is much more decentralized, that is much more empowering to the people who are actually running these operations, and less focused on configuring monolithic systems. And why is that important? This idea of balancing the tension between efficiency and flexibility. What I want to do now is share a brief example of what this actually looks like in the wild. So, over the last few days, starting last week, there was an incredible effort that was launched here, based in Boston. It's since rolled out nationally. And this is, it's called maskson.org. And this is an open source initiative that is designed to give our medical service providers much needed PPE in this time. So we're looking at, a peak of the COVID-19 cases to be hitting Boston and most of the coastal cities in the next 14 days or so. And, as everyone is aware, there's been a critical shortage of PPE. There's been a critical shortage of ventilators, of hand sanitizer. And so a lot of things that these folks need to be able to safely treat people who are infected with COVID-19. This is an open source initiative that's designed to get them the supplies they need. So the product that we helped ramp just in the last seven days or so, it's about a week and a half old at this point. It's a reusable N95 mask, and it's specifically designed for an anesthesiologist. And these are the folks who are operating ventilators that are keeping patients alive. The unfortunate thing is that this also means that they're being exposed to an aerosolized version of the virus, and they're most susceptible to infection. And so what we've built here is a fully enclosed face mask with an N95 filtration unit. This is reusable PPE. The filtration unit is replaceable, but the goal here is to distribute 50,000 of these masks in the next few weeks. And over the course of 5 days, we've gone from 0 units produced to over 1,000 units produced a day to help meet this demand. And I want to talk a little bit about what that operation looks like and how it works. So the operation, again, this is an open source initiative. So this is not taking place at a single physical production facility. So I think this is a perfect example of what this looks like, of how you go from ramping up a highly scalable operation very, very quickly that is very, very complex and distributed across multiple different work centers and multiple different roles. And so, I just want to really quickly explain how this operation works, kind of at a glance. We'll go over this pretty high level. But there's two sources of information, there's two sources of raw materials here. The first these are available off the shelf items. So these are things you can go to Target, you can get on Amazon and you can order. And then there's a set of componentry that needs to be specifically fabbed to modify these off the shelf hardware and make this and convert it into something that is appropriate for the medical community. And so the sourcing operations here are we order a bunch of stuff. We order a bunch of stuff off of Amazon, and when I say we, I'm referring to this community that's ramped up to meet this demand over the last couple of weeks. So we order all the material that we need off the shelf. we rapidly design and source components from 3D printing shops and the like. And then all of this is picked up by a group of volunteer couriers. So these are folks within the community who sign up on the website. They raise their hand and they say, hey, look, I want to help out with this. So they're literally just running around picking things up and dropping them off. So they go and they pick up these items. Oftentimes meeting locations are like outside of in a Target parking lot or something like that. They pick these things up. They drop it off at a pop-up assembly center. The pop-up assembly center is going through a production operation where they're combining these components, they're assembling them, and they're performing the modifications necessary to solve the problem that our clinicians have. When they're done, these couriers go back to any of these production centers, they pick them up, and then they'll take them to the hospital where this PPE is needed the most. All of this is being coordinated by a regional coordinator. And these operations are taking places they're taking places in multiple cities now, and it involves a number of different moving parts. And so the question is, how do you even begin to manage a system like this? Well, in the early days, and when I say the early days, I'm referring to 7 days ago, this whole operation, this is pre-production. So at this point in time, 7 days ago, they had built a couple of prototypes, but they weren't in full production yet. But all of this was coming together using frankly, using a lot of the same tools that, many of us rely on for our manufacturing operations and to run these operations. We're talking paper forms, spreadsheets, text messages, calling each other. There's a number of different Slack channels where a lot of this stuff was being coordinated. And that was good because that was fast and it allowed us to go from, hey, here's an idea to let's ramp up an MVP. But it's certainly not scalable. And if this is something that's going to be producing and distributing 50,000 masks here over the next couple of weeks, next 6 weeks, it's absolutely not something that's going to be able to scale. And so with Tulip, using the same types of functionality and some of the same tenets that we had discussed earlier in this webinar, we basically helped them build this into a scalable production system using an app-centric view. So there was fundamentally 4 different apps that had to be built. First was an order requisition app. So this is a clinician saying, hey, I have a need for some PPE. This is my location. This is how many units I need. And these are the specific items that I require at my operation. The second is a fulfillment manager app. So this is the fulfillment manager app and the inventory manager app. Both of these are being used by the regional coordinator. So they're saying, okay, I have demand. Where can I assign this demand to actually produce this stuff? So they would say, okay, couriers, I need to pick up inventory from this location and drop it off at this production center. This production center has X number of units that are produced and ready to go, and they're all serialized and being tracked. I need a courier to go pick that up and drop it off at the hospital. And so managing fulfillment and managing inventory were 2 things that were, that we were able to do very quickly using a Tulip application. And then finally, this courier app, this was, we'll get into it a little bit more here in a moment, but the courier app is basically something that anybody can open up from their cell phone. And you can think of it almost as like, it's almost like a water spider application, but it's, it's kind of an ERP meets Uber. So, the courier signs up, they specify their location, they say how many miles they're willing to service, and then they're notified of all the production centers that are in their service area and all of the distributions and all of the hospitals that are in their production area. So if there's an open order that needs to be fulfilled or an inventory that needs to be transported from point A to point B, if that's within their service area and they're available, they'll get a text message through a Tulip app, they'll acknowledge the text message, and then they'll go pick up the inventory, they'll drop it off at the place where it's needed. And all of this is being managed. So this is I guess if we take a step back, what we've produced here is a highly, highly specific and also a highly sophisticated ERP system. The difference here is that rather than collecting all of the requirements and rolling this out top down, we deployed multiple MVPs very quickly and iterated on them over the coming days and sort of, and we're able to build out this functionality on top of that using a much more bottom-up approach, using tools that the people who are responsible for these parts of the operation could understand and engage with. And the total time it took to go from what you see on the left to what you see on the right was about 4 days. So we, I mean, quite literally started working on this Friday night, and it's in production today. So this is what it looks like for a new user. This is a courier signing up. They enter their cell phone number, they put in their location, they specify the range that they're able to service, they enter the times of day that they're available to help out on this effort, and then they'll go ahead and they'll say, you know, they'll receive requests, they'll pick them up, and they'll drop them off, and they track everything using that mobile application. Now, if you're a clinician and you need this, what you would do is you would go ahead and say, okay, I'm going to open up an application on my laptop computer or my tablet or something, and I'm going to say, here are the products I need. Go ahead and get me this stuff. And then this would go ahead and populate the regional coordinator's view. So they're going to go ahead and look at, okay, what are the total open orders that I have right now, and what available inventory do I have, and which couriers are online right now that I can assign this to. The couriers then, once it's assigned to them, they would go through and they would pick it up. They would acknowledge it on their cell phone. And so what we've enabled is complete end-to-end tracking for this entire production system. And you know, all of this is using all the typical Tulip capabilities, so text messages and everything like that. So that's a brief overview on, I think it's somewhat serendipitous. We said, hey, look, you know, we should talk a little bit about how customers can ramp up production operations very quickly with Tulip. It's a great tool to do this. We scheduled this webinar a couple of weeks ago, and then after that, we had this open source initiative come to us and say, hey, can you help us stand up, ramp a new product and stand up a distributed operation over a weekend? And so I wanted to, you know, share this example as well. But with that, I'm going to go ahead and you know, I'm going to turn it over to see if there's any questions. Yeah, I mean, I thank everybody for joining. Appreciate everyone's time today. But we'll go ahead and leave some time here to handle some Q&A, and we'd be happy to address, you know, anything we've covered today or anything else that's on folks' mind. So with that, I'll go ahead and hand it over. Okay, so one of the questions here is, can we share a case study from pharma of EBR and line clearance? Yeah, and this looks like a request for some follow-up. So happy to send that along. We see that request, and we'll be in touch with some examples. I mean, these are both great use cases that are pretty prevalent in the pharma space. So electronic batch records, maintaining a log of all of the you know, all of the items that are added to a particular batch of active ingredient, and then managing this digitally as opposed to you know, maintaining you know, a paper log of this. And then line clearance is another big one. We've got several customers doing this today. And the line clearance application is, you know, it's very different than what you're looking at on the screen now, but the line clearance application is, you know, one of our customers that comes to mind. You know, they've got it's a continuous manufacturing operation, so it's process manufacturing, but they've got these big you know, big pieces of equipment that need to be maintained. They need to be broken down about once a quarter. They need to be you know, maintained and reassembled. And so what Tulip is doing there is really there's 3 use cases. The first is guiding the operation itself, so giving everyone you know, giving folks who are operating this all in parallel a better set of work instructions. So this is a very complex operation. It's not something they do regularly. So it's providing videos and the media that's necessary to be able to do this efficiently. And then it's also coordinating activity across different team members. So, you know, these have to happen in a certain order. So maintaining is, you know, is operation 1 complete before operation 2 can start, you know, is operation 3 can start. And then the third thing that's happening there is maintaining traceability of who did what when. So happy to, you know, share a little bit more about how we do that. Okay. Bear with me one second here. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen, but it looks like there's a couple of questions I want to be able to answer here. So the first question here is, all right, so the first question is, would it be possible to share a manufacturing operations example that covers day-to-day operations in engineering? Yeah, so I think a couple of examples of manufacturing operations that we encounter, I think, more day to day. And please go ahead and raise your hand if I'm not answering your question. If I'm not answering your question, but the question is, share some examples of things that we encounter day to day and how engineering becomes involved. And I think the most common use cases that we see here are things like production tracking, performance dashboards, machine monitoring, quality checks, audits. These are all pretty work instructions, training applications. These are all examples of use cases that manufacturing engineers encounter pretty regularly across all operations, whether you're making high-end luxury jewelry, whether you're making medical devices, whether you're making aerospace and defense, whether you're making an inertial guidance system or footwear apparel. I think this is stuff that we see pretty commonly deployed across the customer base. And the next question is, does Tulip have a case study about continuous manufacturing in the wire cable industry? We do not. So we have not specifically worked in the wire and cable industry. We have done, I'd be curious to understand, this is from Lehman Ryan. I'd be curious to maybe connect offline and hear a little bit more about what it is you're looking to do there. We've seen, we haven't specifically done work in this space, but I'd be happy to connect with you and see what we could do to potentially help out with anything that you're working through. All right, and the next question here is, what is the cost of the platform, as I would like to start brainstorming a proposal for my company? So our pricing is on our website. There's 3 tiers of the Tulip platform. We're software as a service, so we price by station. And you can think of a station as any endpoint or any place where a Tulip application that has been built is being used in a production environment. And so the number of applications that are running concurrently is the total number of stations you would have. And our pricing starts at $100 a month for just for software only. If you want to connect machines and backend systems, connect machines, sensors, devices, then you would be in our what we call our professional IoT tier. And then our enterprise tier includes a lot of the advanced functionality and a lot of the regulatory requirements. So if you're operating in a GXP environment, or if you have specific integrations with backend systems that need to be taken into consideration, that would put you in our enterprise tier. But you can basically think of this as $100 a month, $200 a month, or $300 a month, depending on what tier you're in. But again, all of that information is available on our website as well. And so the next question is, can Tulip connect with old equipment to extract data? And we didn't talk about it too much, other than to just briefly mention that Tulip does support machine monitoring. And but this is a really interesting point. So there's a few different ways that Tulip can connect with with hardware on the shop floor. So the first way is using, if these are already, let's take a CNC machine or a lathe or something like that. If these are already networked devices, so if this is it's already connected, through Kepware or something like this, it's already speaking OPC UA, then we can just import that OPC UA directly into the Tulip platform, and we can use that to monitor these machines. But many customers have machines that are older and that don't have these modern connections. They were designed in an era in which people weren't thinking about how the internet was going to be used to monitor these operations. One of our customers, they have a piece of equipment. It's like a big 50-ton stamp. I think it's got to be at least 80, 100 years old. And quite literally, but anyway, the point is that for these older pieces of legacy equipment, we can monitor these using using our IoT platform. So we can use a combination of different sensors from, from a current sensor to an inductive sensor to measure if a crankshaft is changing, to a brake beam sensor. So this analog machine monitoring use case is actually a pretty powerful one for Tulip, and you would take advantage of this by just getting our IoT gateway. You would get into one of these no-code applications, that I've been discussing here. You would build out some simple rules, and then you would basically say, okay, these are the sensors that I'm looking for, and then these are the parameters that I'm going to use to define whether this particular machine is running, yes or no. And so you could say if if the inductive sensor sees a crankshaft go by it every 5 seconds, if current is being drawn, then the machine is running. If both of those things stop, then the machine is down. So the short answer is yes, and that's how we do it. All right. Any other questions from the group? All right. Well, listen, I appreciate everybody taking the time to join for this webinar. We'll make the deck available after the fact here. So if we can send this as a follow-up. If you have any other questions or things we didn't have a chance to get into on today's call, please feel free to shoot us a note. We'd be happy to connect with you and talk a little bit more about it. Yeah, I hope everybody has a good day, and appreciate the opportunity to share a little bit about what Tulip is doing and share some pretty interesting use cases about how we're helping the open source community ramp production of these PPE masks. So yeah, thanks a lot. Everybody have a good day.